welcome to SportsBeat KC, the Kansas City Star Sports Podcast. I'm Blair Kirchhoff, and we're talking baseball on this episode, but not the Royals. They're still playing better than anyone outside their clubhouse expected, but we'll check back with the boys in blue on another show. On this episode, we're discussing baseball's decision to integrate statistics and records from the Negro Leagues with Major League Baseball and what it means to the record books. Columnists Sam McDowell and Vahe Gregorian join the conversation as we explore how this came about and what it means for the game and the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum in Kansas City. Of course, you can't talk about the Negro Leagues without hearing from museum president Bob Kendrick, and we'll play about 15 minutes or so from his press conference. Okay, let's get started. Look who's back.
I never really went away.
You never did, only department.
Yeah, but you notice where I still sit.
Yes.
I sit right by you guys, feeling my roots.
Right in the middle, smack dab in the middle of sports. Well, welcome back, Vahe.
Thanks for allowing me, deigning to have me with you, Blair.
For this podcast that we're going to discuss the very recent decision by Major League Baseball to integrate Negro League stats into the Major League statistical treasure. There are numbers. The decision was actually made about 3 years ago, and then it took quite a while for the committee of researchers and historians and statisticians and anybody else, including Bob Kendrick, who said he was on that committee as well, but didn't do much of the math, to come up with the most accurate compilation of numbers here. And what it, kind of one of the headlines is a player like Josh Gibson now becomes baseball's all-time leader in single-season batting average and slugging percentage, and I believe the career leader in those stats as well, plus OPS. Josh Gibson, the great catcher in the 30s and the 40s in the Negro League. So let's talk about this and what it means, and later in the show we'll hear from Bob Kendrick. And anytime you get Bob Kendrick, his voice on a podcast, you got to do it, right? Sam McDowell is here too. Sam, what was your reaction to this, and what are you going to write about?
My first reaction was kind of stunned that Vahe wasn't asked to be on the statistical committee because nobody knows newspapers.com like he does. and this is really a win for newspapers because that's where they found the stats. But putting us aside from the story, look, I think it's a cool deal that it's at least however long this news cycle is that the Negro Leagues are in the news cycle. Because it is an educational opportunity for people that don't know about these players, the Negro Leagues itself. But, I mean, all of us have been on the tour with Bob many times, and he doesn't mention stats anywhere along that tour. And his tours will last over an hour. I've seen him take Major League players through there. There's a lot of dignitaries that have come through that tour with Bob, and it's not about the numbers for him. It's about, the way – I asked him about that today, and I think his quote was, it's a story about America. He always calls America her. He says America at her worst, but also America at her triumphant best. And that's the story you feel when you walk through the museum. It's not about how many home runs Josh Gibson hit. But, like I said, it's still a cool thing because this is a vessel to get – those stories that Bob does tell.
It's funny you use the word vessel. I was just thinking of, and I don't know if this word really applies quite right, but this sort of moors the Negro Leagues into the collective in a way that is long overdue, but a different form of credibility is the wrong word because it had its own credibility, right? But it's mainstreamed in a way that players of that time could probably never have imagined it actually being acknowledged.
Bob actually used that word today, yeah.
Did he? Mainstream?
Yeah.
It's, and I think we know it from, our very fortunate relationship with Bob Kendrick, to be over at the museum a lot, to be exposed to the museum. But I do think it's an ongoing learning opportunity for a lot of America. I don't know when you first discovered that there was a Negro Leagues. I didn't know until I was in St. Louis in the early 90s and was assigned to cover Cool Papa Bell's funeral. And I went and covered the funeral. It was fascinating, a lot of interesting stories there. But that was the first time I'd ever even heard of it. And I think about that often because I think that we assume people know about it. But one of the missions of the museum is to keep spreading the word, and this will obviously help.
I was a baseball nut as a kid, and I remember in the early 70s, I think it was 1972, when Satchel Paige went into the Baseball Hall of Fame, and that was a big deal. And I remember reading about why it was a big deal and discovering, wow, there was another league besides the one we all knew growing up, people our age. And so, yeah, I guess I was in tune to what the Negro Leagues were, but it wasn't until I moved to Kansas City and got to know Buck O'Neill a little bit, covering Royals games where he was scouting, and then talking to him after games. He would wait and unwind from a baseball game with reporters after a game, and so you got to talk to him and get to know him a little bit and to hear his stories. And this was before he did Ken Burns baseball. So, I don't think I remember thinking at the time, boy, it'd be great if he got on a 9-part documentary series to discuss some of these stories.
He'd be a fit.
Yeah, it would work. But he did, and it did. So it's a treasure to have that in our city, the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. And not only are players like Josh Gibson and Satchel Paige, and who did play Major League Baseball for a little while, but Oscar Charleston, Cool Papa Bell, some others going to benefit from this. But players who became major leaguers and spent most of their careers in the major leagues, but had some experience in the Negro Leagues, they'll get some additional stats out of this.
Yeah.
Willie Mays is going to get a few more hits, and Minnie Minoso and Ernie Banks, players like that, their statistics will be enhanced because of this. I think that's kind of cool.
Yeah, I mean, it would have been really cool if Hank Aaron had like 10 more home runs or something and became the new all-time home run leader. It'd be hard for any of us not to root for him to hold that record, I think, over Barry Bonds. But, there's, even Jackie Robinson had.
That's right. Had Monarchs numbers.
Yeah, I mean, several dozen hits in the Negro Leagues before moving over. It's a really cool place in Kansas City. I agree with both of you guys that I don't know how many people outside of Kansas City know about it, and hopefully today does help people want to learn more and figure out that this is a place that you can learn more about it.
Let me ask you guys this question, since I had a conflict and wasn't able to attend today. How much more explicit and specific is our knowledge now of the way this will be spliced in, for lack of a better term, to the stats? I had been under the impression that once this was legislated a few years ago, that you could see it pop up in some different reference points and databases, but I guess it was always unofficial till this certified how it would be done.
Yeah, I mean, that's what this is. I mean, so they did announce in December 2020, like Blair said, that they were going to go through this process of getting, I think it was more than a dozen people involved looking for old stats. And reading a little bit more about it in the Washington Post, they were pretty particular about they had to have the full box score to integrate it. And that includes recording of the outs and stuff, like putouts and, assists for infielders. And, there was an example where they found one game that Josh Gibson hit 4 home runs. They know he did it. It was written about. They didn't have the box score for the game. So that game was not included in it. And there's estimates that they think they found about 75% of these stats. They did not include exhibition games, which Blair asked Bob a good question about today. The career numbers are not going to be in line with major leaguers because they played about a third of the games. in one season. They didn't include these exhibition games in which they'd play teams from like Venezuela, Dominican. They'd occasionally actually play major league players in some of these games too. But this week is like that they're now part of the records. They're same. They competed against the major league records, and the Negro Leagues, the ones that Blair mentioned at the top, won out in a lot of instances.
I remember it being very emotional in December 2020 because that was also a time of, for the museum, reeling from COVID, or
Right.
a lot of places reeling from COVID, but it was the start of a sort of upbeat uptick.
I hope there's some kind of display at the museum that will list some of these stories. The only place I get baseball statistics anymore is in on baseballreference.com, which is an incredible resource.
Yeah.
But we know what's happened to box scores and stats in newspapers, and there is no sporting news. We used to get box scores and sporting news. For those of us who are old enough to remember that. The places where we access this information has changed over the years. So I would think a cool display at the Negro Leagues Museum would be, just a list of the top 5 all-time leaders in career batting average or slugging percentage, and have a Josh Gibson name on the same list as a Ty Cobb or a Babe Ruth or some of the players that he has surpassed in on these lists. And I think that would drive home the point that they're all in this together now.
Yeah, that tour starts that Bob gives, and I mean, we all said this 1,000 times, just haven't said it today. Like, Bob brings that museum to life through those tours. I mean, going through the museum is a great experience on its own, but it's just a whole nother world when you go through it with Bob. But he starts that tour, and coincidentally enough, he's right next to Josh Gibson when that tour starts. And so I had asked him after the presser today if he'll include that, and he said, of course. And he said, but it'll be supplementary to the main story of the museum, which is how I kind of view this whole thing, over the last 24 hours.
I really love the way you're looking at this, because it's really fascinating, right? There's a different confirmation of what was done by these numbers, but it does not supersede the broader point that you're making. I mean, that the story is the struggle. The story is America at its best and worst, as Bob likes to say. Creating, you won't let me play in your league, I'll create a league of my own, as Bob likes to say.
Yeah.
So that's still really the story, but I guess the broader impact of this, we'd hope, is more ripples out of it.
Yeah.
Bob mentioned today too that he, sensitive is not the right word, but he's cognizant of criticisms. He goes to social media and sees what others are writing, and this isn't been universally accepted.
Yeah.
But to be honest with you, I guess I haven't plugged in the right keywords to find out what the actual criticisms are. Have you seen any of them?
Yeah, I mean, there's the criticism that they played fewer games, and so therefore it's a smaller sample size for some of the single season records you mentioned for Josh Gibson, where he hits well over 400. What was it?
It was like 463 or something, or something like that.
So yeah, there's criticisms about that, but Blair, you and I were talking about the museum, and I was saying, like, this league was harder because of the lives of these players was considerably more difficult, to where, when I went back, Blair, you and I, like in 2019, wrote about all these teams that had gone through this tour.
Major league teams.
Yeah, and Bob had told one of them, because one of them had asked about the meals. I think it was Tommy Pham, maybe. At that time he was with the Rays. And he was asking about the meals, and he said they brought peanut butter and crackers because they didn't know if that city would allow them to eat. There were some places where they couldn't shower. They didn't wash their uniforms between games, one day to the next. Like, they were under just a lot more. And then, as Bob said today, they still took the field with the same expectation to perform that major leaguers did, who had all that stuff that I mentioned that the Negro Leagues were without. So, like, I understand that the whole small sample size is a very 2024 argument, and it ignores the fact that, in the 30s and 40s that these players had it a lot tougher than any players do today.
Yeah, I think one of the criticisms, just going from memory here, has been, well, it's apples and oranges. They weren't playing against major league players. I'm doing air quotes on this as I say it. I don't remember Buck O'Neill's exact quote about this, but it's something that Bob has drawn on before. That with the twinkle in Buck's eye, who says they weren't playing against major league players? And I think it is hard to know how to fuse that together, but I think we can understand and appreciate that in the context of who they were going against. These were terrific players who, as we all know, simply didn't have the opportunity to put their skills on the major league field. But
who's to say the major league,
Yeah,
major league records are not apples and oranges as well.
Right, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. And I'm glad you explicitly said that, because it draws attention to the idea that we're working with a framework that is sort of not bogus, but it's not right to begin with.
Yeah.
And I think it's easy for people to forget that. Well, like, this is the way. Well, that's that way because of prejudice and bigotry and
Right. Well, if there's any, if you have any doubts about this and you want to check it out for yourself, I highly recommend a visit to the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum in the 18th and Vine District in Kansas City. It is a phenomenal building. Listen, you can do the tour in a half an hour if you want, but I suggest you read everything because and look at all the displays. It is fantastic. And this summer, there's the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum celebrating the 100th year anniversary of the Kansas City Monarchs winning the first Negro Leagues World Series, 1924. So Kansas City's first professional sports championship was won by the Kansas City Monarchs. Okay, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, you will hear from Bob Kendrick, the president of the Negro Leagues Museum.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Bob Kendrick, president here for the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. I wanted to take this opportunity to answer any questions and to offer my own commentary about this epic announcement that took place officially today, although the news, it wasn't a very good kept secret. The word kind of filtered out yesterday about the statistics of the Negro Leagues officially being rolled into the pages of rolled into the pages of Major League Baseball's history books. And of course, this goes back to December of 2020, right in the throes of COVID, when Commissioner Rob Manfred made the historic announcement that Major League Baseball, first and foremost, was going to recognize the Negro Leagues again for what we already knew it to be, a major league. And that it was then going to adopt the statistics of the Negro Leagues and insert them into the pages of Major League Baseball's record books. That was in December of 2020. It has taken a little longer than people had hoped that it would, but I also hope you understand how diligent those Negro League historians, researchers, have the commitment that they've made to unearth information that a lot of people thought could not be ascertained. And that is what has led us to this point. And it is absolutely a watershed moment for both Black baseball and Negro Leagues history. And I do believe that all of us, family members of those players of the Negro Leagues, that small existing number of Negro Leaguers who are still with us, and of course, all of us here at the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum who are stewards of this story. This is significant. And as Commissioner Manfred said, I hope that these statistics will be a gateway into wanting to learn more about the Negro Leagues. Because let me preface by saying this. You cannot reduce the story of the Negro Leagues to statistics. You just can't. This story is far more grandiose than mere statistics. This story in many ways is bigger than the game of baseball, even though it is a tiny part of the great story of the game of baseball. But for those who needed this quantification, because our sport, as you all know, is the most romanticized of them all, and is the one sport where we constantly compare the stars of yesterday with the stars of today. And there are those who needed statistics. You now have those. Now, will there be those who will be unhappy about what you see when you look at those categoric statistical rankings? Of course there will be. Because some of their legendary Major League stars moved down in the list. That does not diminish them. It is just now providing some names that perhaps you should have known about before now, and you're getting the opportunity to learn about them. We certainly hope that they will take the opportunity to learn about them. And so, yes, this is indeed an exciting day. It was a long time coming, and I am so deeply proud of everybody who worked so diligently on this project. And like I said, this is just the beginning. And it has been a tremendous run for the Negro Leagues in Negro Leagues history in this museum. And I think this is just an example when we think back, going back to 2020 and that epic announcement, and then Buck O'Neill's induction into the National Baseball Hall of Fame, which was so embraced by the baseball world, and the Negro Leagues inclusion in the video game MLB The Show, which is educating and entertaining so many young people about many of these heroes who they'll see now in the statistical list. So this won't be a surprise to them. It'll be a surprise for those Major League Baseball fans who really didn't know about the history of the Negro Leagues. Just getting back from Cooperstown and that incredible weekend there with the opening of the National Baseball Hall of Fame's Black Baseball exhibit, the Souls of Baseball, the recreation of the old East-West All-Star Game, one of the greatest sporting events in American sports history. And very few folks knew anything about it. When they were putting 50,000 fans in Chicago's Comiskey Park for this showcase event. All of that came to life. Now with the official entry of the stats into the pages of Major League record books. And of course, as we look forward to June 20th, headed down to Birmingham, Alabama, to Rickwood Field, where this epic salute to the Negro Leagues will take place on those hallowed grounds. Of course, where a young 17-year-old, Willie Mays, first walked on that field, began his historic career as a member of the Birmingham Black Barons, patrolling center field there for the Birmingham Black Barons. And Willie Mays, without question, is the greatest living major leaguer. But in the eyes, minds, and hearts of many, Willie Mays is the greatest baseball player of all time. And he comes out of the Negro Leagues. And as many of you have heard me say on countless occasions, he, Henry Aaron, Ernie Banks, they are just samples of the talent that was there in the Negro Leagues. And I know that there are some who still subscribe to the belief that if it didn't happen in the white major leagues, then it didn't happen. This museum has been here for 34 years to tell you, yes, it did happen. And now we're gaining additional momentum. We've moved one more step closer to moving Negro Leagues history and giving it that mainstream voice. And I go back to something that my friend Buck O'Neill said to me when I first met him in 1993. And I had posed a question to him at that time. But what motivated you to want to build a Negro Leagues baseball museum? And his answer was succinct, but also very poignant, so that we would be remembered. And they are being remembered perhaps in ways that even old Buck might not have imagined. And this is not a culmination, this is just the beginning. We've just scratched the surface in terms of the kinds of things that you'll see continue to evolve through the lens of the Negro Leagues. But man, what an incredible day this is, I think, not for just those of us who are stewards of the story, those who are fans of Negro Leagues history, those who are fans of baseball history, but I truly hope those who are fans of American history, because this is truly an historic occasion and a date that will be remembered for years to come. All right, that's enough of me running my mouth. I would be happy to take any questions that you guys might have of me relative to what has been announced by Major League Baseball.
So, Bob, Josh Gibson is one of those that supplants Ty Cobb and Babe Ruth on a couple of those records, and those are names people would know even if you don't follow baseball. I'm sure you would agree that Josh is an all-time player, but does this solidify him as an all-timer, not just an all-time Negro Leaguer, but an all-time great baseball player?
You know, and I'm not one to say I told you so, but I've been telling folks for the longest that, in my own humble opinion, Josh Gibson was the greatest baseball player to ever put on a baseball uniform. When you look at what he was able to do as a catcher, and as many of you know, he wasn't a good catcher. He was a great catcher. And he is arguably the greatest combination of power and average this game has ever seen. And to see his name at the top of so many of those statistical categories, well, it's not surprising to me, but it would be surprising to a lot of folks. But it just echoes what I have been saying for the longest. He was the truth. Josh Gibson was the absolute truth. And you no longer have to take my word for it. Yeah, because everywhere Josh Gibson played, Josh Gibson hit. It didn't matter. He lit everybody up. He was an equal opportunity. He didn't discriminate on who he beat up on. He beat up on the pitchers in the Negro Leagues. He beat up on the pitchers when they were playing in Puerto Rico, Venezuela, Cuba, the Dominican Republic. He beat up on major league pitchers in countless exhibition games. And so his name will now resonate, I think, in, again, a mainstream capacity and puts him where he, I think, so deservedly belongs.
All of the one, Boston Charleston, and a couple other guys that may not be as notable as Josh Gibson on that list. What's it mean to have some of those guys that are some of the lesser known figures? You know, they're big known in Negro Leagues, lesser known maybe from a popular standpoint, but they're not recognized.
Well, it goes a long way, and Harold, we used to carry a poster. And I thought this poster so beautifully summarized the Negro Leagues. Just because they weren't in the same league as Babe Ruth doesn't mean that they weren't in the same league as Babe Ruth. And so those stars like Oscar Charleston, who maybe, years ago you heard Buck O'Neill talk about Oscar Charleston, who's right here in center field behind me. And Buck always believed that Oscar Charleston was the greatest baseball player to ever play this game. Well, now he's being injected into the consciousness, at least, of those who will have every opportunity, if they so choose to learn more about Oscar Charleston and what made him so special. And for me, I'm not enamored with the numbers because, again, I hope that they will just serve its purpose to help people want to learn more. That's what I'm more about. This is a teaching moment and a teaching opportunity for us, and we are a teaching institution. That is the core of what this museum represents. But sometimes it takes these kinds of efforts that will hopefully open the minds, hearts, and the imaginations of those who will eventually want to learn more about the history of the Negro Leagues through the statistical data that is now being placed in front of them. And they're going to see these names that won't instantly jump out at them. And I hope they'll delve deeper and want to learn more.
How many researchers were involved?
It was a substantial team, an all-star team. We're proud of here in Kansas City, the likes of Larry Lester, Phil Dixon, who are two of the most noteworthy Negro League historians in the country. I guess you could even say in the world, were part of this team. The folks over at Seams Head, Gary Ashwell, and over at Baseball Reference, all these folks were involved in this effort. So this has been yeoman duty in terms of pulling together, I guess you could say, a dream team of Negro League historians and researchers to try and pull this data together.
When you say substantial, over 50, less than 50?
No, less than 50.
Okay.
Less than 50. My name is listed on there, but let me tell y'all now, I had nothing to do with these numbers. These folks are much smarter than I am. I was there to be part of it because I felt like they felt like the Negro Leagues Museum needed to be represented. But these people have dedicated their lives to this kind of work. And I, by no stretch of the imagination, would want to diminish the effort that went into this. It wasn't finding a needle in a haystack, but damn near was. Yeah, the work that had to go into this. And then, like I said, Greg, there's still more work left to be done.
Well,
Yes, sir.
All of us have been through this museum with you enough to know that, like, a lot of your tour is not about the statistics, but a large audience through this news is probably learning more about the league through its stats. But what would you like them to know just beyond the numbers about, the history of the league itself?
When I think about the importance of the Negro Leagues, there are three key themes that come to mind. This is a story about the importance of economic empowerment. This is a story about an unprecedented level of leadership that emerged as a result of the formation of these leagues. And then ultimately, this is a story of the social advancement of our country as Jackie Robinson is handpicked from the Negro Leagues to be the chosen one to break baseball's then 6-decade-long self-imposed cone barrier. But this is also the story of America at her worst. But it's also the story of America at her triumphant best. As I've oftentimes said, you won't let me play with you in the major leagues, then I'll create a league of my own. And as I remind my guests here at the museum, when you stop to think about that, that is the American way. And so while America was trying to prevent them from sharing in the joys of her so-called national pastime, it was the American spirit that allowed them to persevere and prevail. What's not to love about that kind of story? And I think that's what we experience with the people who come here. I think they come here expecting to be introduced to a sad, somber kind of story because we understand that this is anchored against the ugliness of American segregation. But by the time they walk out of here, they walk away, I believe, cheering the power of the human spirit to persevere and prevail. And I don't think there was ever a time that people didn't want to know about the story of the Negro Leagues. They just had no way to know about the story of the Negro Leagues. It's not in the pages of American history books. And as I oftentimes say, as my late mother would say, you don't know what you don't know. And we're here to help you know. And we hope that those who walk through these doors walk out understanding the significance of what the Negro Leagues represented off the field. Because for me, it's a given that you're going to walk in this place and you're going to be some of the greatest baseball players to ever put on a baseball uniform. In many ways, Sam, we de-emphasize the ball players in lieu of this story that had escaped us for so long.
Hey, Bob, could you speak to why some of the, you said the numbers, not that's a give, the totals. Could you speak to why some of those totals aren't higher and maybe the difficulty the teams had in playing 150 games like major leaguers were doing?
Exactly. There's an economic impact that was felt by the Negro League, so the seasons were much shorter. And so the sample size from a career number standpoint may, in the eyes of some, diminish some of these players unless you truly understand how to delve deeper into these statistical data. I ducked and dodged probability and statistics my entire time when I was in college. So this is beyond my feeble brain as well. But you have to be able to kind of understand, okay, here's Josh Gibson's home run per at-bat ratio. So his career totals, because of the sample size being diminished, won't be Babe Ruthian in the eyes of so many, because it does not account for every game that Josh Gibson played, because we only are looking at official league games. In my eyes, every game that Josh Gibson played could have very easily been part of these totals, because it wasn't Josh Gibson's fault that he couldn't compete against the major leagues, that he had to play in a Negro Leagues. But I understand the mindset and the formula that went into place. So you will have to be able to delve deeper because the career statistics kind of, and particularly in certain categories, stolen bases, home run kinds of categories, those are going to be somewhat diminished in the eyes of some baseball fans unless you are able to again delve deeper and understand the equations that went into place in and around compiling these numbers. But basically it's a much smaller sample size because the Negro League seasons were much shorter and scale of economy had a lot to do with why they were such short seasons.
That'll do it for this episode. Thanks to producer Randy Mason for putting together the show, and to our SportsBeat KC staff of Monty Davis, Jeff Rosen, and Scott Chasen. Tip of the cap to Sam McDowell and Vahe Gregorian for sharing their insights. Thanks for listening. Let us know what you thought of the show by leaving a review and rating. We'll be back soon with another SportsBeat KC where we talk sports in and around Kansas City.